Dr. Christopher Hobbs from King's College London to speak today on the subject of securing the nuclear supply chain and exploring counterfeiting and other risks. I'm personally really excited about this topic. For those who don't know, I'm Jessica Barnum. I'm the Deputy Director of the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. And my own personal research interests actually intersect quite heavily with what you're doing, both in terms of the nuclear industry when it comes to nuclear power, and in terms of open source intelligence techniques for assessing some of the issues that you're going to discuss today. I am very curious, I'm sure you'll get into all of this and be able to ask you questions about how some of the topics others in this room have worked with your team on in the past, like additive manufacturing and artificial intelligence, intersect with these counterfeiting risks to the nuclear supply chain. But I think your background in science, and I should mention that he is currently the director of the UK's Nuclear Security Capacity Building Program, a government academic industry initiative focused on reducing global nuclear security risks, and previously led the UK's Nuclear Security Culture Program. But I think your background both in physics and in policy is a tremendously policy relevant skill set for the group today to hear about. So I'll just turn it over to you. Okay. And I'll be happy to moderate questions when we get to that stage.
Super. Well, thanks, Jessica, for the kind introduction. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Also, I appreciate the invitation to spend some time here at CNS from Margarita and Bill. So hopefully it'll be a really productive few weeks. And it's great to be able to share with you all today some research that myself and colleagues at King's have been doing when it comes to supply chain security. I would say this is a relatively new area of research for us. We sort of got into it through this IEA coordinated research project, which we were part of for a couple of years. But it does build on some of the other areas of research that we've been having a look at for quite a while, such as the insider threats, security culture, regulatory approaches across the sort of nuclear sector, the interface between nuclear safety and security, and so on. So I'll talk about some of those things and some of those recent sort of technological advances as well, additive manufacturing, AI, sort of RFID, blockchain, and so on, in terms of how the sort of threat and risk side of this sort of may evolve in the future. So yeah, so that's a great introduction. So overview for my talk. I'm going to just briefly sort of mention nuclear security in the sort of narrower sense that I'll be talking about it in this presentation. People will probably be very familiar with that, though. And then I'll talk just a little bit about what is counterfeiting, because I think maybe for some people that might be a slightly a topic they're not necessarily sort of as familiar with. We'll look briefly at some past counterfeiting cases, both in the nuclear sector and also in non-nuclear sectors. I think that's quite useful in terms of informing how counterfeits can get into high security facilities and also some of the impacts that they can actually have. And then I'll do a little bit of a dive into sort of the history of counterfeiting and efforts to respond to that in the global nuclear sector, going back to the 50s and then coming up to the present day. There has been a real sort of flurry of activity in recent years, but there is still more to do, and we're sort of trying to highlight that with a survey and some interviews that we conducted with government and industry officials around the world, which identify some areas of strength, but also some gaps that hopefully need to be addressed. Then we'll look at how the sort of risk landscape in this area might evolve into the future, looking at sort of new technological advances there, but also some of the potential I guess, increase and interest in various threat actors, you know, in this space, certain perhaps, nation states and others that may be sort of more interested in terms of infiltrating our supply chains. And then in relation to that, I want to talk about a future area of research that we're just in the process of embarking on at King's, which looks at the use of AI and big data to map supply chain to the nth tier and have a look at different sort of risks that may sort of come with working with particular types of suppliers because of how they're interconnected and so on. But yeah, more on that a little bit later. I know that probably ties into quite a bit of work that's been done here at CNS. Okay, and also just have a little brief slide, just sort of King's. I think some people are sort of very familiar with that, but not necessarily everybody. You know, we've not been running as long as CNS, but we've had a relatively, I guess, sort of large group focused on a broad array of nuclear and CBRN security issues. Set up the Centre for Site Securities back in 2001 with a grant from the MacArthur Foundation. And over the years, myself and other colleagues, we've done a sort of wide range of work in this space. I'll be focusing on nuclear security in that sort of narrow sense today, but colleagues of mine have done, work on sort of non-proliferation, strategic stability and deterrence, sanctions, and so on. And again, we do like, I think it's very similar to here, to take an interdisciplinary approach to these complex issues, work very closely with policymakers, with industry as well, trying to sort of bridge the gap so they're going to curve between that. And then sort of as mentioned in the introduction, Kings, we've also led the UK's nuclear security culture and now capacity building programs, which involves sort of working with practitioners from around the world to improve nuclear security practices. And in the context of this project, that's really been very, very useful in terms of being able to get access to individuals, to interview, to survey, to get sort of perspectives on the current state of practice in this area. Okay, just very sort of briefly, and this is probably familiar to most people, I think it's fair to say that nuclear security has been at or sort of near the forefront of the international security agenda for some time. It doesn't mean that there's not still work that needs to be done, in this space. And again, you'll sort of see recommendations by groups such as the Nuclear Threat Initiative and the Nuclear Material Index that talk about some of the things we still need to be sort of focusing on. But there has been, I would say, sort of a lot of progress, sort of in this area, driven at that high level by concerns over the potential threat of nuclear terrorism, driven more on the sort of industry level by concerns posed by, say, insiders responsible for most if not all of the known thefts of nuclear material over the years. And we've seen lots of high-level political initiatives, such as the Nuclear Security Summit, the entry into force of the amendment to the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material. We've seen things like the conversion of reactors from running on high-enriched uranium to low-enriched uranium, setting up of sort of global systems for border monitoring aimed at sort of detecting illicit material outside of regulatory control. We've seen efforts to improve sort of physical protection around nuclear facilities, combat the insider threat, strengthen security culture, and so on. So a whole host of things have been done to improve nuclear security over this time. But when I sort of started looking at this particular sort of topic through this IEA CRP, I sort of, I guess even myself, someone that's worked on nuclear security for some time, I hadn't necessarily thought about this as a potential sort of risk vector from a nuclear security perspective. So I would suffice to say that, I think it's a very interesting area to do some research on, thinking about the nuclear security supply chain and how it can potentially be infiltrated by adversaries. And I'll focus this talk on counterfeiting, but again, there are sort of other risks that need to be thought about as well. Okay, so the next one is what is counterfeiting? So I think everyone is probably familiar with this, certainly when it comes to sort of more well-known consumer goods. So what we're really talking about here is the unauthorized manufacturing or labeling of a product that imitates the original, but isn't actually produced by the actual original sort of manufacturer or person that owns the IP for the brand. So it's a form of intellectual property violation, sort of related to but distinct from piracy. It's very difficult to estimate how much counterfeiting goes on around the world, but the OECD had a report a couple of years ago that estimated it's a couple of percentage points of total world trade. And while it doesn't necessarily seem very significant, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of trade in counterfeited goods, so it is actually quite large. It's also something which can be quite prevalent within certain sectors. So there was a UN-OECD report back in 2022, which looks at counterfeit medicines, and in certain areas of Africa, for example, these are very sort of prevalent. And it's estimated that sort of tens of thousands of people in Africa die each year from counterfeit anti-malarials, which they're taking, which don't really provide any protection against that particular disease. The thing I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation, which is sort of most relevant for the nuclear and other critical sectors, is what is referred to as deceptive counterfeiting. So the idea of this is counterfeits that are produced, which look close to the original, which are sold at similar prices, which are distributed through similar routes, which the person that buying them believe they are actually legitimate. And these are some of the most sort of dangerous types of counterfeiting threat. And that's quite different from what you see on the top right-hand slide, which is a Gucci bag, a real and a sort of fake one, which is an example of sort of non-deceptive counterfeiting, where the people are buying it at a much lower price, possibly from someone selling it at the side of the street, so not from legitimate channels, are aware that what they're getting, it isn't real, but there are benefits to them sort of getting in, and they're happy to sort of accept that. So they kind of know what they're getting. But in other cases, deceptive counterfeiting, you don't know what it is you're getting. And there's two other examples of sort of deceptive counterfeiting there on the right-hand side, taken from an IEA report on this topic. There's a circuit breaker, there's a computer chip, and as you can see, they look pretty close to the original. So again, if you're sort of procuring those for your facility, you might not sort of spot that they're actually counterfeit and won't necessarily work as intended. Oh, and I should just, if that pops up the top, that's actually how it's referred to in IEA guidance. So in IEA guidance, the issue of counterfeiting is referred to as counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. So suspect items are items that are believed to be sort of counterfeit or fraudulent. Fraudulent items may be sort of genuine items, but are sold at, say, for example, fraudulent certificates or testing data that report to have capabilities that they don't necessarily have. Well, counterfeits are things that are produced in a dedicated manner to originally to imitate actual items. So yeah, sort of interrelated sort of set of terms. You may see when it comes to the survey data, this referred to as CFSI. So for the purpose here, we just refer to that as counterfeits. Okay, so what are some of the reasons that people that produce counterfeits are motivated to do this? Well, I think historically it's fair to say that the most common reason would be sort of financial gain, and there's lots and lots of examples of this. But there are other potential malicious purposes of which you do see some evidence of as well. It is possible to produce counterfeits that have additional sort of undisclosed features, such as malware or spyware, which could be used to exfiltrate data from a particular organization. You can also think of the installation of counterfeits in key systems, such as, let's say, security systems, which might degrade the capability of those systems such that it might enable a separate but related attack, whether it's by insiders, whether it's by external adversaries. And you also see examples where counterfeits themselves can destroy or significantly disrupt sort of key systems, so used for more of a sabotage type purpose. The other thing I'll say is this is really not a new phenomena with the use of counterfeiting for malicious purposes dating back centuries. And here, given that we're here in the US, I just wanted to bring up this example of the use of coal torpedoes during the US Civil War in the 1860s. So if you like, you've got counterfeit coal here. So what looks like a real piece of coal on the bottom left of this slide is actually explosives in a metallic casing covered with sort of coal dust to make it look like a piece of coal. And this was used by the Confederate side several times during that conflict to sink Union ships which ran on coal. It was a really sort of a good way, I guess, if you like, to do this, because coal at the time was stored in big piles often without any sort of security around it. So it was almost impossible to tell when you're shoveling coal into a steam engine, whether it's a legitimate piece of coal or whether it was actually an explosive, which was sort of created to look like that. We also saw very recently, and I think this will be familiar probably to most people here, this attack that occurred on the 17th of September in 2004 in Lebanon, where communications devices, walkie-talkies and pagers that were used by Hezbollah operatives simultaneously exploded. This is a real sort of high-profile example of a sort of physical supply chain attack. It killed tens of people, injured thousands of people. It disrupted the communications capability of Hezbollah at the time, so it really was very significant indeed. What was interesting about the attack from a supply side perspective is that with the investigation that sort of went into it, and also the revelation as well by those that sort of perpetrated the attack, was that the explosives have been inserted during the manufacturing process. And the way that they did this, and again, there's articles written on this, so I won't go into huge detail, was done in a sort of very sophisticated and long-term way, where over the course of several years, Mossad created a number of shell companies from which they could legitimately buy these items and then either insert explosives or manufacture their own with sort of the same markings to make it look like the original items, and then sell them on to Hezbollah, where neither those in which they were procuring the items or the license to distribute those, or Hezbollah they were selling them to, had any idea that it was actually sort of Mossad that were working here in the middle of that. Okay, and then I'll just also another recent example, which you may or may not have heard of. It's interesting because this company was based in London. It's still an investigation that's ongoing with this company, and its CEO are currently sort of being prosecuted. But it's alleged that this company, which was an airline parts distributor operating since 2015, provided a number of substandard parts to major airlines around the world through falsifying documentation relating to their origin, status, or condition. So here, and this is seen quite often in counterfeiting, old parts are acquired and then are passed off as new or reconditioned. And this is something, again, which can sort of penetrate an industry, even one as sort of high safety and security as aviation, because of some of the pressures which airlines may face. Pressures to get the certain parts they need for maintenance, so they can get airplanes, back in the sky, so they're not losing revenue. Also cost pressures to try and buy parts slightly cheaper, if they can, and that can allow these types of counterfeit infiltrations to happen. And indeed, they have happened, historically over time. A very dramatic incident here is the crash of Partner Flight 394. So this is a Norwegian airline. I think crash taking off from Denmark back in the 80s, where it was found from the subsequent investigation, where they collected the piece of the wreckage of the plane together, that the bolts that held the tail of the airplane together were actually counterfeit, and these had broken off during the flight, and the back of the plane had broken off, and that had caused the crash. It's actually one of the case studies in the handbook we've produced if you want to read more about that. Okay, so thinking a bit more about how these sort of may manifest, in particular sort of in the nuclear sector. So there's a whole host of things that actually have been counterfeited and found their way into nuclear facilities. And you can read about this more in this IEA guidance document produced in 2019. So just sort of listed on there, but it's a wide range of sort of electrical, mechanical, safety sort of related items and other things like that. There have been a number of cross-sector studies as well, albeit some of these sort of relatively dated. So there's one produced by the US Department of Commerce that indicated that sort of counterfeiters are likely to go over sort of relatively sort of high demand, low to moderate price items. So volume is something that's quite important there. There's also other studies that sort of note how counterfeiters often focus on hard to find products because, again, these can be sold at a relatively sort of premium price. And here the idea is that counterfeiters will take advantage of weaknesses that organizations might have when it comes to obsolescence management. And again, this is particularly relevant for the nuclear sector, where nuclear facilities such as power plants may run for decades, and where the original equipment manufacturers that produce certain parts may no longer sort of be in business or have those parts available. But due to regulatory requirements, they really have to try and use those parts or ones that are sort of close to that. So again, if there's not a great obsolescence sort of management program in place, again, people can be desperate for parts. And again, that's where counterfeiters can take advantage of that. Also fair to say, that counterfeiters are always looking to take advantage of new opportunities as they present themselves. This was seen during the COVID pandemic with a lot of counterfeiting when it came to sort of PPE. Also when it came to computer chips, where there was a shortage of that at the time. Again, the counterfeiters would flood the market with these in an attempt to take advantage of that. Okay, so what can be done to reduce counterfeiting risks? Well, at a very sort of high level, there have been sort of international efforts that have been brought to try and sort of protect intellectual property. So there's a treaty here which has been negotiated by the World Trade Organization back in 1995, which asked the states to put in sort of minimum standards when it comes to sort of legislation and also processes for prosecuting counterfeiters. And you do see this followed down to sort of the national level, but there are some real challenges here. So in general, when it comes to finding and prosecuting counterfeiting offences, these are not sort of hugely resourced. It can be very difficult to prosecute people because often they'll be working across sort of different national jurisdictions in free trade zones and other places where legislation is relatively lax. And many of the penalties here are also quite low. We were having a look at a US report when it came to prosecution of counterfeiting offences back in 2023, and only 67 individuals were prosecuted, and that's in a country as big as the States, which has significant, capability when it comes to law enforcement. So very much really just the tip of the iceberg. So what this means is that I think a lot of dependency here is sort of placed not necessarily as much on the sort of preventative end of the spectrum, but more when it comes to sort of detecting counterfeits, before or sort of as they enter facilities. And there's a whole host of things here that industry can and are sort of doing in this space. When it comes to sort of selecting what are hopefully legitimate suppliers, such as the original equipment and manufacturers or authorized distributors. When it comes to adopting sort of systems around sort of procurement management, so thinking about what are some of the high risk sort of indicators, such as an item is sort of much cheaper than you would normally find in sort of other places, but also more subtle than that. Efforts to improve sort of obsolescence management. So, for example, predicting, over the lifestyle of a facility, what particular parts might you need, and then sort of storing those parts, or having many sort of copies of that so that as they break, you can replace them without having to go back to the original manufacturer. This ability to conduct inspections at suppliers to check that they're following all the sort of necessary quality assurance type protocols, as well as sort of verifying and testing the parts when they come into that facility. So actually sort of breaking them down and checking that they actually do what they say they do. Okay, in terms of impact the counterfeits can have on nuclear facilities, again, this sort of is discussed in more detail in the handbook. We've got 12 cases, 6 nuclear and 6 non-nuclear. But they have been installed in nuclear facilities in the past, and they have had some serious consequences. So they can degrade facility performance, impact worker health and safety, as well as sort of undermining nuclear security and safety systems. The first example there back in Mexico, this was an incident where there was a fire at one of the diesel generators, so sort of secondary sort of cooling systems, so sort of key safety element. And here a counterfeit piston pin had been sort of put into that diesel generator just part of the maintenance operation. That caused it to catch fire, and the fire was contained and nothing else sort of happened, but relatively serious incident. And in the examples of sort of South Korea and Japan, here we've got examples of hundreds and if not sort of thousands of counterfeits being installed at facilities over an extended period of time. And some of these pretty safety critical. So in Japan, we're talking about a sort of fire suppression system which was installed with fake certification documentation and then had to be removed from that facility at a huge sort of time and cost expense. Okay, so these are sort of general insights from those cases. So yeah, definitely you want to detect counterfeits before they're actually installed in the facility, because once they are installed, it can be pretty costly and time consuming to identify all the counterfeits and find replacements. And this actually in the South Korean case, this resulted in extended reactor shutdowns or reactors shut for periods of months, which then affected the country's electrical grid. So there was actually rolling blackouts that this caused. In terms of some of the cases, a lot of these actually involve falsified testing, inspection, or certification data. In some cases, it was known from the companies that were procuring this that it was actually fake, so there was a level of collusion between individuals at those facilities and the supply chain companies. In others, it was more sort of rogue individuals that were acting at the supply chain companies who were, for example, falsifying testing data because they didn't want to actually go through the rigmarole of actually doing it, doing a real test, on this. And there's an interesting example there actually from the UK back in the either late 90s or early 2000s. There were cases I mentioned in Mexico where counterfeits were introduced during maintenance. And again, this is quite common. You would see this in the aviation and other sectors as well, where the urgency to get a sort of part replaced can override the sort of normal quality assurance checks that you might have. There are several cases where counterfeits are introduced sort of much earlier in the supply chain rather than a direct or sort of tier one supplier. And I'll talk more about that a little bit in terms of this sort of Future Kings project that we're doing, because that I think is a very sort of interesting area to look at. And in terms of contributing factors to the CFSI infiltration, so there's a whole host of these, from weaknesses in broader organizational culture when it comes to safety and security. So in some cases, potential counterfeit incidents weren't reported because people didn't necessarily know where it was. And in cases where they were, management didn't necessarily sort of take action on this. Poor sort of procurement and supply chain management practices, and not buying from sort of dedicated, sort of known to be trustworthy suppliers. And as well as people not sort of necessarily being aware of this risk, or being able to undergo training in this area. And again, more about that a little bit later. Okay, so now I'll just take a very sort of quick step back and talk a little bit about the history of counterfeits in the global nuclear sector, something which is talked about in this sort of other paper that we've published. And I think it's fair to say that, there has been, from the very early days of the nuclear enterprise, there has been this sort of recognition that reliability and integrity of what goes into a nuclear facility or system is very, very, very important. And in many ways, the US has sort of led the way in this across sort of different areas. So you can trace this back to standards that were set in the 1950s for the US nuclear weapons program, naval propulsion, submarine programs, and then sort of later on in the power programs as well. The importance of quality and this needs to be managed through relevant programs. This became more of a sort of global thing in the 1980s with the IEA entering its first sort of guidance documents in there. It was also enshrined within the Convention on Nuclear Safety in 1994. Article 13 talks about the needs for sort of reliability and quality assurance as a key component of nuclear safety. There were also cases of counterfeiting which first started to be reported in the 70s and 1980s. So the US NRC, you can actually go back and sort of look at these documents, issues sort of a number of warning notices, nuclear power operators, telling them sort of the different types of counterfeits that have been found within other facilities. I think at this time it was a particular challenge for quality management programs to detect these, because again, these were sort of set up to assure that what it was coming in was sort of a quality product and had the necessary sort of testing data and certification, but it wasn't focused on detecting fraudulent practices. So again, if it looked like you had that, it was, dare I say, it was sort of perhaps more of a tick box at this time than perhaps a sort of investigative questioning type approach into looking at these in terms of actually sort of verifying that what was being procured was exactly what it said it was. However, when it comes to sort of broader international discussion, this still remains sort of limited, I would say, throughout the sort of 90s and the 2000s. IEA produced its sort of first guidance in this area in 2000. And this led to, from the 2000s to the 2010s, several of these cases which are captured in that handbook. I think what is a disconnect between the counterfeiting threat and how it was manifesting in the nuclear sector versus how it was actually perceived. And there's an interesting report by the Nuclear Energy Agency in 2011, which asked for a number of sort of national opinions on this issue of sort of counterfeiting, with vast majority of these, except for the US and a couple of other countries, highlighting that they didn't see this as a particular issue, not one that was sort of worthy of specific regulations, policies, or training. And this was sort of occurred just before we saw those significant incidents, particularly in sort of Northeast Asia, that as sort of mentioned sort of previously. So again, at least in the 2010s, this wasn't an issue that I think the majority of sort of the global nuclear sector was taking particularly seriously. However, that has sort of been changing over the last sort of 10 years. So again, I would say that those cases, sort of relatively high profile, helped to propel counterfeiting up the agenda. And you see sort of more frequent mentions of this, whether it's in the Convention of Nuclear Safety, whether it's discussed during the IEA general conferences, and so on. It led to a much more sort of detailed and updated IEA guidance document in this area, and so on. But I think one of the questions we had in when we were sort of embarking on this research project here at King's is, there has been this greater recognition in the sort of international level on this, but to what extent this has actually translated into effective programs at the industry level. And this is really kind of the key level, because this is the level where, hopefully counterfeits will sort of get detected and then, and if installed, removed. So in an effort to have a look at that, what we did was working under this coordinated research project supported by the IEA. We did some surveying and interviews with government industry officials around the world. So I would say that it was a pretty small sample size, albeit it was from a number of different countries, anonymous surveys as well. So what I would just say on this is, and if you read the paper, don't read too much into statistics. So it's more a sort of a way of sort of gathering diverse opinions on a topic where there not much empirical data actually existed. Okay, so, and again, this was conducted in 2014. So we asked this question in terms of, have there been any cases at your facilities where CFSIs have actually sort of defeated your procurement practice and been installed in the facility? And as you can see, in the majority of cases, no, but still in a pretty significant number of cases, yes. So it's still a sort of occurring issue, I would say, within the industry today. And then we also asked them to talk about what are some of the different types of products, counterfeit products that actually have been detected by your organizations. And again, this is attempted, so it's not just those that are installed, but also those that were caught by sort of procurement type programs. And as you can see, it is a wide range of different things. It encompasses sort of both safety and also in one case, security related equipment. We also wanted to understand sort of threat perceptions in this area and how these sort of may have changed from like sort of 10, 15 years ago. And I think what was sort of very reassuring in this, there's a vast majority of people that we spoke to agreed, that this is a significant threat, and this is something that we need to do about. So that's a big shift from that sort of NEA report that I mentioned back in 2011. Okay, so I think it's sort of fair to say that there is definitely sort of growing international awareness, and this is sort of translating it down, to industry to an extent. There was this sort of big disconnect in the past, I would argue, and now it's being sort of closed, somewhat. However, that said, there's still a lot more, that needs to be done. Approximately half these people we surveyed said they had something in place in terms of regulatory basis, whether it's sort of specific sort of laws or regulations that sort of governed counterfeiting and the reporting of that to the national regulator. But the other half of them said that they didn't have anything, sort of in place. Reporting and other sort of associated stuff was on a much more sort of ad hoc type basis. I think what was interesting as well, even for countries that do have sort of regulations in this area, there's a risk that these may be sort of limited or interpreted in this sort of narrow sense. And there's a very interesting report which has been produced by the Office of the Inspector General at the US Nuclear Regulatory Mission back in 22, which had a look at how sort of US nuclear industry were reporting cases of counterfeits. And it found in this report that they were only reporting and sharing cases where counterfeits had infiltrated real critical safety systems. So a lot of the other cases of counterfeits, some of which talked about already in this talk, wouldn't necessarily have been sort of shared or reported, under that. So they were interpreting the regulation in a very sort of narrow sense, and they sort of put in corrective action to that could be, interpreted much more broadly. I would also say, and this is true obviously with any sort of aspect of sort of nuclear security, that there is sort of real variation between different sort of national organizational approaches. So again, approximately half the survey respondents had some very clearly defined requirements and criteria when it came to supplier selection in terms of who they would buy particular products from based on their potential safety or security risk and the types of suppliers from which they procurement. But others didn't necessarily have this criteria, which again is a bit of a weakness. Again, a handful, 5 or so, survey respondents said that they didn't, employ sort of follow-up inspections or other verification processes to make sure that the items they received were actually genuine. On a very positive note, most survey respondents sort of talked about that when it comes to critical items, they only really purchase these from original equipment manufacturers or authorized distributors. But again, a handful of others sort of noted that they did make use of independent distributors, brokers, and individual sellers, where again, you don't necessarily have the trust that what you're receiving is actually genuine. Okay, and then again, this just sort of breaks down some of the different types of verification processes, that organizations put in place. So again, it's a mix. Some will actually go to the supply chain and the manufacturers and will actually conduct inspections there. The majority will do some form of receipt inspections after receiving a particular item. Others will employ third-party testing laboratories where they'll send that item to for it to undergo sort of relevant testing. But as you can see, there's on the right-hand side, there's still a significant number that don't do any verification processes at all. Okay, and again, this is just some of the, as sort of mentioned, some of the different ways in which industry can sort of help to, sort of fight the counterfeiting issues, some of these different types of programs that can be set up. And as you can see across, there is a sort of wide range of, seeming good practice that is sort of ongoing. Okay, I sort of hinted at this previously in the other historical sort of cases, but again, I think when it comes to broader nuclear security, while it still does arguably sort of like behind nuclear safety, in a way, there has been this big push over the last 20 years to encourage everyone working at a nuclear facility that security is part of their responsibility. It's not just the responsibility of the guard or response force, and I think that is sort of definitely growing globally. However, I would say that this doesn't necessarily exist yet within the counterfeiting area. And again, from some of the interviews we did, they were sort of pointed to the fact that when it comes to the issue of counterfeiting, how to respond to it, it's really those that are working in procurement or quality assurance, that have some understanding of this. If you're working more in sort of research or engineering or something like that, you probably would maybe very unaware, of this, which means that when you encounter a system that is sort of malfunctioning or breaking down, you won't necessarily think this could be due to a counterfeit. This could be more of a systemic type issue rather than a sort of one-off. So again, that's sort of something which I think needs to be broached. And I think related to that, the training for staff in this area, it is somewhat limited. Half of respondents said that this either occurred less than once a year or had never happened. So there was no training on this topic. Okay, so I think there's also, and this sort of relates to some of the biggest challenges, which I'll show on the next slide. There's definitely opportunity, I think, to increase information sharing in this area. It was actually very difficult for us to find a lot of information on sort of cases in there. It really required quite a bit, of digging. And the respondents that were back on the survey we interviewed said that, one of the biggest challenges that they have when it comes to understanding the threat, when it comes to designing training programs, is we don't have a lot of information here on sort of past cases. However, it's not an easy thing to do. Timelines can be quite long when it comes to sort of investigating and prosecuting cases involving counterfeits, and there may be sort of legal implications that need to be thought about when it comes to sharing this information before those cases have actually sort of concluded. So that's sort of an obstacle in this area. However, there arguably, I think, is more that could be done. Could there be another initiative under the auspices of the IEA, some sort of database that would actually sort of capture well-known sort of counterfeiting cases and share this with the sort of global nuclear sector? And there are sort of examples of this done more sort of at the national level, but none of it is really comprehensive. There is this actually very good counterfeit electronics database that's been set up by this organization, ERAI, so for the Electronic Resale Association International, they have 25 years of sort of counterfeit data, and it's updated on almost sort of daily basis with new cases. So again, this could be an interesting thing for, say, the IEA or others to sort of think about the model which they use there. Okay, and this just sort of summarizes some of the key sort of challenges which nuclear industry is sort of struggling with in this area. As mentioned on the left, absence of information is sort of a big one, but there are others in there as well, intrinsically difficult ones, like on the right-hand side when it comes to the length and complexity of supply chains, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. We have time.
I think we're fantastic still.
Okay, yeah, another 10 minutes? Yes, fine. Okay, perfect. So I wanted to talk about this and just mention this introduction in terms of evolving sort of, threats and sort of risks in this space. And I think we are at an interesting juncture in a number of sort of different ways. Firstly, just on the sort of threat side and the sharper end of that. Historically, a lot of the cases which I sort of referred to, but not all, a lot of this is really sort of motivated primarily sort of by financial reasons for economic gain. However, I think in the future, we might see more examples of sort of state-directed espionage and sabotage. And indeed, there's been sort of recent reports of countries, such as Russia, looking to undermine sort of Western supply chains and distribution routes. There's fires in the UK and in Poland and elsewhere through explosives being discovered, being sort of trafficked, sort of through these mechanisms. So we might see more of that, and maybe more aimed at sort of critical national infrastructure as well. We also see the exploitation of artificial intelligence by counterfeiters. So again, used in a variety of different ways, but it can be made to look sort of make organizations or their associated products look more realistic. And there's lots of cases where companies have sort of used AI to create sort of vast, very realistic websites, LinkedIn sort of type profiles, and so on. It can be used on a more sort of technical level to produce quite realistic sort of testing and certification data that's very difficult to discerning the difference from something that is actually genuine. There's also additive manufacturing in there. So again, this is sort of more increasingly being used, particularly, for example, on the battlefield in sort of Ukraine as a way of producing sort of parts, which is sort of needed on the front line, sort of very, very quickly. In the wrong hands, this can be used to produce sort of high quality counterfeit products that could, again, be very difficult to distinguish from the original. However, on the flip side of that, I would say that, additive manufacturing, it can also be potentially very useful when it comes to overcoming the obsolescence issues that I sort of talked about previously. And I think there are some sort of examples of nuclear industry making use of this. So again, the 3D printing of parts that would be very difficult or take a long time to source. So again, you don't have to go out to the open market where, again, you don't necessarily trust the suppliers. There's also, I think, a lot of research going into sort of interesting ways in which 3D printing can be used to insert additional sort of anti-counterfeiting measures, such as magnetic tags that could be sort of hidden in a product that would be very difficult to replicate. And there's been a lot of sort of interest in this in different sectors, such as the pharmaceutical one, where, again, it's counterfeiting is a real issue. So is there ways to put sort of security-related measures in sort of medicine such that it's going to be very difficult to actually fake those, or more difficult? There's also, I think, some interesting things that can be offered when it comes to sort of radio frequency identification mechanisms such as RFID, as well as blockchain, when it comes to sort of tracking in real time, creating these tamper-proof records of items as they move through the supply chain. For this to be effective, obviously, industry would need to actually sort of take this on, but there have been some examples in recent years, of this. There was a blockchain prototype developed by the Finnish Nuclear Regulatory Authority in partnership with the Stimson Centre and others when it came to sort of safeguarding nuclear materials. And there's also been some initial efforts to apply blockchain to the nuclear supply chain more generally. There's an example on that slide of a company in Argentina that's set up a blockchain to do this. When it comes to the use of AI, I think there's a lot of ways in which, as mentioned, AI can increase the capabilities of threat actors in this space, but it also can be used to support anti-counterfeiting efforts. So there are a number of ways in which AI is being used when it comes to its computer vision capabilities to detect defective and counterfeit parts during that manufacturing process, as well as can also be used to detect sort of unauthorized worker behavior that may violate safety and other protocols. And then, as with one of the projects we're looking to embark on here at King's, I think there's some really interesting stuff that can be done when it comes to exploring the capability of AI tools and associated big data sets when it supports of supplier risk assessments. Here in particular, I think there's this possibility of using these combination of technologies to look much deeper into supply chains beyond just your direct tier one suppliers. And here is an example of a paper published a couple of years ago by academics at Cranfield, which just sort of hints at the importance of being able to look more deeply into your supply chain. This specifically on looking at deceptive counterfeiting risk. And what this shows, just one figure taken from that particular paper, is that it's not your primary suppliers, that are most often putting counterfeits in their products and selling it to you. It's actually the people they're buying those parts or components or modules off, or the people that they're buying it off. So it occurs further down the line. And this is just a specific example, non-nuclear, which just sort of shows how counterfeits can actually get into, sort of high security sort of defense equipment, because you don't necessarily know your supply chain or who it is you're ultimately sort of working with further down the line. So this dates back to 2012. It was a counterfeit ice detection module that was installed in the P-8A Poseidon Boeing 737 plane, which was purchased by the US Navy from Boeing. And Boeing had BAE manufacture this module for them, but BAE had procured that module from Abacus Technologies, who then had it tested at Tandex Lab, but it hadn't been tested particularly well. What was unbeknown to Boeing and BAE at the time is that Abacus Technology had actually procured that from a company in China. So again, you're going all the way back there, if you like, from to tier 4 or 5 We're running low on battery, but I think I can power through it. Yeah, hopefully. So I haven't got many more slides.
As long as the battery's not counterfeiting.
So yeah, this is just one example in terms of how you might have a risk factor in your supply chain, but it may be nowhere near the top. Okay, but you won't necessarily sort of know that for a variety of reasons. And again, just see if I can. There we go. And again, this is just broader studies that sort of suggest that many organizations, their visibility of their supply chain and their extended supply chain is quite limited. And you can see here a stat from McKinsey in 2021, who surveyed a load of companies, and only around 2% of them can actually map their supply chain beyond their first or second tier. So very, very low indeed. Another thing I'll just say as well, we focus in this talk on counterfeiting, and that's the research really that we've done to date here at King's. But when organizations think about their supply chain, they think of a wide range of different risks. There's been some real sort of high profile supply chain cyber attacks in the UK recently. Marks and Spencer's, one of our sort of supermarket branches, was massively affected by this, but it wasn't an attack directly on them, it was an attack on their supply chain. And again, this is where there may be sort of weaker sort of information and cybersecurity measures in play, but it's a way to get at the target that you're actually sort of interested in. There's a possibility when it comes to sort of proliferation and sanctions violation risks. And I think everything I've referred to so far is really more on the sort of upstream end, but you've also got to think of that downstream end as well, particularly in the nuclear sector. You know, who you're selling your products to and where those products ultimately end up. And there have been a number of really good papers published by colleagues such as Rusi and elsewhere, which had a look at how Russia had procured technology for their sort of UAV and missile programs from Western suppliers through a series of sort of front companies, similar in the way to the explosive walkie-talkies and pages I talked about earlier, or similar in spirit to that. Broader environmental, social, and governance type risks. So whether elements of your supply chain have sort of poor working, practices, maybe they have poor environmental standards, they're doing a significant contribution to climate change as well. Again, all of this is becoming more important. Financial risks, will your suppliers, are they likely to go sort of bankrupt at key points within your supply chain? Are you relying on sort of multiple suppliers that seem independent, but actually at a couple of tiers below, they're all connected to the same particular single point sort of manufacturer, which if that fails, then all of a sudden you won't be able to procure something from anywhere and so on. So there's all sorts of really sort of interesting and complex risks in there. And I would just sort of say that, it's more important probably now than ever to understand where our goods or services come from and our products actually end up. So we need to know more about our supply chain. However, to know more about supply chains, is complicated. There have been studies estimating, if you look at the global economy across all sort of sectors and industries, that something like 300 million firms, of which maybe sort of 80, 90 million is sort of big public corporations where a lot is known, but the majority are sort of smaller private entities where it can be more difficult to get information. And they're all connected through these sort of tens of billions of supply links. And in certain sectors, supply chains are pretty complicated. They're transnational. They may go 5 tiers down. They may have thousands of nodes. We're working with a couple of nuclear suppliers at the moment to sort of map their supply chains, and they have something like sort of 500-600 tier 1 suppliers, and they're connected to a similar number of suppliers, and so on and so on and so on. So as you map this down the chain, things can get very, very complicated indeed. There's also reasons why it can be difficult to ascertain this information from your supply chain directly. There's a whole host of reasons why suppliers may not want to give complete data on their supply chain. They may not want to expose potential vulnerabilities. They may not want to sort of be cut out of a supply chain if you can go to sort of their suppliers sort of directly. There are other reasons why this might give their competitors an edge if they give certain information away. There are ways, and these are sort of traditional ways in which organizations have gathered data on their supply chain. A lot of it is sort of carrying out their sort of audits and inspection I already talked about, or surveying their suppliers. But these can take time, be quite costly, and only provide this sort of static picture in time when supply chains themselves are, very dynamic. You might go forward a couple of years or even 6 months, and a lot of the supply chain linkages will actually have changed in that time. What exists here, I think, though, which is quite interesting in the last decade, and there's a variety of sort of different academics and others that are working on this for a variety of purposes, not necessarily security. But there has been this sort of big revolution in sort of data sources of relevance to supply chain visibility, and I've just put some of those up there on the internet. And that's it, I think. But yeah, that's okay. But suffice to say, yeah, we're planning a project at King's, which really sort of tries to look at the potential to sort of map out some nuclear supply chains with focus on sort of UK sector, where we've sort of done a lot of work using some of these new sort of AI tools that are coming online and using some of these big data sets, while also sort of looking at a whole host of sort of threat-related data to come up with some interesting risk models in terms of how we can characterize that threat within there. So yes, that's sort of an active project on us where we're partnering with our Department of Informatics, who are sort of the AI data science specialists there. Yeah, but I can leave it at that.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. So before I throw it out to questions here and on Zoom as well, I just want to ask one kind of framing question myself, which is this whole presentation really triggered for me the question of, I'd love to see a slide or a book or something like that that shows us what the distribution of responsibility on avoiding counterfeiting is, which is to say, if I'm the end user, I have a certain list of responsibilities that I should personally be in charge of to make sure that I'm not. And I'll just use an example of, let's say I want to buy IT equipment for CNS on, I want to get Dells or I want to get Samsungs. It's my responsibility to make sure that I'm either going directly with the company or with an authorized supplier of the company. If I go on Amazon and go with some random sold by this company I've never heard of in China, I, as the end user, screwed up, right? Like I'm asking to get counterfeits in that case. But if it is sold by and fulfilled by Amazon and they are an authorized supplier of Dell and they got tricked, I have no insight into that happening. If Dell got tricked when they were manufacturing and there's a chip in there that they got counterfeited or something like that, I have no insight into that, and Amazon has no insight into that. And so it seems to me there's a list of things I, as the end user, have to do. There's a list of things the producers of these things have to do in their own supply chains. And there's a list of things that some overarching regulator has to be responsible for. And to be able to address any of this effectively, we all need to kind of get together and understand what and accept each of our mutual and separate areas of responsibility. And so how do you take that apart in terms of finding solutions?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great way of sort of summarizing. I would agree with all of it. I think obviously in this talk I focus much more on the sort of the end user and what sort of the end user is doing on it. But it's not to say, and hopefully I guess nuclear organizations are not buying too much off online marketplaces, right. Such as Amazon, but I know for sort of broader consumer goods, and you can buy IT equipment from there, obviously, and other things as well.
But they probably have authorized suppliers of some kind.
Sure,
So for what I'm buying, Amazon might be an authorized supplier of Dell. For what they're buying, there's probably something that's an authorized supplier of
yes, absolutely.
Some company they deal with.
Yeah. Well, I definitely know that, online marketplaces, from the reading I've sort of been doing about it, they are sort of investing in technology, which is designed to sort of uncover what are potentially sort of fake companies, that are purporting to sell these sort of legitimate or certified type items. So there is work in terms of taking down those types of listings, I think, on the marketplaces. How effective that is, I'm not necessarily sure. And then, yes, absolutely, when it comes to the actual sort of suppliers themselves, they should be also taking a good look at their own, sort of supply chains. Yeah, because again, if there are issues there, reputationally and sort of otherwise, that's going to be sort of very damaging to them. That said, I don't think necessarily sort of huge amounts exist when it comes to more sort of, let's say, sort of regulatory fines or sort of like shutting down business so they can no longer operate in a particular market. I mean, that there is this sort of big ongoing investigation, as mentioned, with AOG Technics as one example in the aviation industry, and that company, probably, the investigation is ongoing, will likely be sort of shut down and the individuals involved sort of prosecuted. But I think, as I mentioned previously, in a lot of sort of national sort of legislations, the actual penalties for this type of thing are relatively lax, so that needs to be sort of bumped up at that end. But I think that's kind of a massive ask. I think, as I sort of mentioned earlier in the presentation, the sort of transnational nature of a lot of this makes it really, really difficult. A lot of these companies are sort of producing these counterfeits, are operating in sort of jurisdictions, whether it's sort of free trade zones or particular countries. I think it's well known that sort of there's been a lot of this historically happening in China, where again, different types of sort of intellectual property laws sort of exist compared to what we might have in the West. So it's very difficult to crack down, on that side of it as well. But yes, as you say, the international community, governments, industry, and their entire supply chains all need to be sort of working together on this. I think there are, particular industries where there is perhaps more coordination. So the automobile industry, I think that's sort of, they've sort of recognized this type issue, and there is, I think, a much greater sort of sharing of information from sort of manufacturers and their suppliers within that particular type of sector. But the nuclear sector itself, you have nuclear dedicated suppliers that go through a sort of form of certification where there'll be extra sort of checks and balances put in place that could be sort of quite well trusted. But then, a lot of parts will also be procured more from suppliers that work across a range of industries that aren't necessarily sort of nuclear dedicated, themselves. And that's likely actually to become perhaps more of an issue, or not necessarily an issue, but more of a thing in this sort of next generation of sort of SMR technology that's coming in, where more serially manufactured parts are in. So that changes things in an interesting way. It doesn't necessarily mean that will necessarily increase the risk, but you do need to have sort of good commercial grade dedication processes in place where, those plants are sort of certified for use in nuclear facilities and so on. I'm rambling now, but suffice to say that it's there's lots of pieces to this puzzle, and probably we don't have the level of coordination that perhaps we need. I think one thing that was interesting for me in this research that we did is that this issue of sort of counterfeiting, when it comes to sort of the IEA in particular, but also I think a lot of sort of national nuclear agencies as well, is seen very much as a sort of safety type issue, but there isn't really a security driver behind that. And obviously, someone coming from the more security side myself, I look at the ways in which it could actually be used in quite nefarious sort of senses. And all the guidance docs I sort of showed there from the IEA, they all come from their nuclear energy series. So there's no, if you look in sort of IEA nuclear security series publications on this, there's nothing that mentions sort of supply chain counterfeits, within that whatsoever. So I think that's something which should be addressed.
I think that's an incredibly important point, because maybe as an addendum to what I'd asked before, it strikes me that where the responsibility primarily lies, whether it's the end user or the regulator, also comes into play when we're talking about the motive behind the deceptive counterfeiting. Is the motive just profit, or is the motive national security sabotage by a state actor against another country? And those are very different things to try and defend against. So thank you very much. All right, so who else has questions? I've got one on Zoom, and I've got you, Robert. I saw Jim Lamson on Zoom first. Why don't I go ahead and go to him, and then Robert, you'll be next.
Well, thanks very much can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. Thanks very much for a really interesting presentation. A few years ago, I'm Jim Lamson. I'm a senior research associate at CNS. And a few years ago, I was a student at National Defense University, where I focused on supply chain management and looked at the U.S. missile industry. And one of the key issues, as you raise, is what we call the risk of adversary supply chain threats, including the risk of what we termed malicious components entering, U.S. missile programs. And one key challenge raised in this context is one you addressed, is trying to increase the visibility into the lower tiers of suppliers in those supply chains, the second, third, and nth tier suppliers, many of which are really small, sometimes a dozen people, and very vulnerable to all kinds of disruptions to their business. So they're already very cautious about all kinds of things. And another challenge was the inability of the DoD to accurately map out their supply chains of these lower tier suppliers, especially those important to critical bottleneck items like turbojet engines, turbofan engines, guidance and control systems, et cetera. And one reason that these companies did not want to share the details over to help the DoD map out its supply chains is, I think you raised it in one of your slides, competition concerns. So, for example, if the information about their key suppliers, whether they're U.S.-based or foreign-based, got out to their competitors, their key suppliers could be stolen by competitors or otherwise, somehow through competition, or there could have other adverse effects on their competition, especially when they're already vulnerable as very small and pretty vulnerable suppliers. So are there some ways that you found in the sectors you've looked at to alleviate these concerns about lower tier suppliers sharing information about their supply chains? Are there some specific things that can incentivize these companies, these really, vulnerable companies, to share sensitive details about their supply chains? Thank you very much.
And that's great. Thanks, Jake. Yeah, I agree with everything you've said there, and really interesting to hear that perspective from the sort of US missile industry. So the approach which we're going to be looking at actually won't be aimed at trying to sort of, I believe there are initiatives out there which are sort of aimed at sort of encouraging suppliers to share more information with each other, stressing some of the more sort of beneficial aspects of that. But I think from what you've said, there's always going to be sort of intrinsic sort of roadblocks and difficulties, to that. So in terms of the project we're we're going to be embarking on, all of this will use sort of open, albeit sort of some sort of commercial and expensive or relatively expensive sort of data sources to map this out externally, if you like, from open sources. So we won't be going out and sort of surveying or trying to collect information from specific companies within different supply chains. So we're going to see what it can be done from external sources on that. So working in partnership with a couple of sort of nuclear organizations who are going to provide us their data on their sort of tier one. So we'll have sort of some sort of very reliable information, but the rest of the supply chain, the plan is to map it out from other sources without that engagement. But definitely agree that would obviously be something which would be very, very useful if suppliers would share more information. But I think it is a very difficult thing to encourage. Yeah.
Robert, and then Gretchen on Zoom after Robert.
Yeah, Chris, thanks so much for the presentation. This topic is fascinating, and I was just going to share one anecdote, but it leads more on the commercial side, but it leads to a security specific question. So just as background, I worked with Toshiba in the private sector, and specifically with the procurement and export division for Toshiba America, which had a supply chain function. We did encounter counterfeit items in the course of some of our regular procurement activities. The one case I'll highlight here is our cell phone production had stopped, and we're talking on a global level, and it wasn't just us. There were other players in the cell phone industry at that time. And so there was a kind of an emergency situation, and we needed to acquire these fairly low-level commoditized parts. I think they were power management modules or maybe memory. And so we went to an authorized distributor who in turn was scrambling to try to find parts on the open market. And they were fairly open about that, saying, we aren't too sure about these, but we found a batch, and we said, we'll take them. And so we purchased them, exported them to Japan, and they were labeled in the way we would expect. In other words, they looked like the semiconductors or the modules that we were expecting, but there was enough distrust there that our team in Japan ran them into. They took the tape and reel, ran it into a stamping machine just to see if this sample set would go through, and it didn't. It was just clearly a case where the components were not even of the right make. Probably they had just been relabeled from scrap. So there's a case there where we had a bit of distrust at the outset, and we were able to detect it. At the same time, somebody was trying to make a profit off of this, and may have at the expense of our distributor and to some extent us. But it seems like that business model for the counterfeiter was really kind of like a one-shot profit gain attempt. We're going to sell these. We know that there's demand, and then we're going to run.
Sure.
And so what I found interesting in your presentation is the term sort of high-quality counterfeit items. And I wonder if I'm just curious your thoughts on this. Does that point to another business model, but still in the counterfeiting sphere, where maybe the aim is to actually establish a more sustainable business relationship, still perhaps hidden from the end user, but aimed at skirting, let's say, producing good enough parts, but skirting, certifications, skirting certain quality control procedures that might be deemed costly. Thus, you gain a certain margin, you have lower staff costs, et cetera. So I'm just kind of wondering, on the one hand, does that kind of type of counterfeiter, does it exist to a significant degree? And then second, does that represent a source of engineering know-how that could potentially be of interest to proliferators, given that these companies, these organizational cultures that are working in the counterfeit space are already used to operating, in in the underground, operating outside of regulatory channels. And so might be more willing to engage in proliferation-related support or activities. So I just wanted to kind of put that into your court and just hear what your thoughts are based on the research and cases that you've explored.
No, thanks, Robert. Yeah, and great example to hear. I think it's a really interesting question. I think, yeah, it's easy to look at the two ends of the spectrum, if you like. So there's sort of quite basic counterfeiting, sort of washing and relabeling of sort of components and selling those, which, may fail sort of basic, quality assurance checks and sort of never get in, but you've made a sort of a quick profit there, to the sort of much more sophisticated, very costly attempts, say, by sort of Israel and Mossad there in the sort of walkie-talkie example, which took years, and setting up front companies and producing sort of super realistic, sort of products, and going through a whole sort of charade in terms of selling them for a particular, sort of purpose in this case. Is there an interesting sort of middle ground where companies can continue to sort of supply, let's say, sort of substandard parts for prolonged periods of time, but without necessarily going through, let's say, the very sort of expensive certification needed, setting up sort of laboratories for testing this and so on? I think an example of that, probably in the presentation, maybe that might be more in that sort of middle ground spectrum, would be the AOG Technics company that was able to sell these parts for 8 years, or so, without sort of being pulled up undetected, on that, or at least they were set up in 2015 and they were sort of exposed in 2023, I believe. So again, they were using sort of parts that were aviation parts. It's just they were old parts, or they were parts that hadn't been appropriately sort of certified as refurbished in this sense. So again, they were aviation parts, but they hadn't gone through the necessary sort of certification they would need for sort of the use in which they were actually sold as. So you do see some, I think, examples of that across different industries, where the parts themselves, they come from the industry, but they haven't been appropriately sort of tested or sort of certified. So again, you can save cost on that sort of side of it. So, but yeah, it's an interesting question in terms of what the utility of operating in that sort of middle space. I mean, obviously you can operate in the sort of lower end of the spectrum, and you can just set up company after company after company, which looks sort of similar. And there's lots of examples of that. But yeah, I guess there's definitely the potential for that sort of middle ground sort of actor to facilitate proliferation, as you sort of mentioned in the latter part of that question. But yeah, I mean, lots more work to be done, I think, on that side. Yeah.
Gretchen, I'm sure you must have some really interesting insights into this issue.
Yes, you know my background well enough. Chris, I'm Gretchen Hund, and I am retired now, but I spent 29 years at a national lab, Pacific Northwest National Lab in Battelle. I'm up in Seattle, Washington, and worked a lot in this area before I retired 7 years ago, something like that. And now I'm currently the chair of something called Plowshares, which you may not know what Plowshares is, but we're an NGO where we end up trying to reduce the risk of nuclear weapons being used. So that's what I'm doing now, my day job, if you will, even though I'm retired. My question is kind of, I'm flipping things on its head a little bit, which is, I'm curious if you've run across any entities that, instead of giving basically sticks, are trying to give carrots to companies who are willing to share basically leads of things that are fishy and counterfeit and don't basically meet what they're supposed to be. And professionally, I looked at that. If you had regulators and entities, even here in the U.S., the FBI, or that could actually say, hey, if you throw that away, that information away, that's free intelligence, that's intelligence that we could really use, and to have it gone is, maybe you figured out that this was illegitimate, but your competitors may not. And so that's not good, right? So we'd really like everybody to know that this is a counterfeit item. So I'm just wondering if there's ever been interest that you've seen in whatever country to do this, but to look at it from what carrots could be provided by these entities to try to encourage more sharing of this kind of thing happening, so that it's one approach, at least, to try to cut it off to some degree. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think probably the best example that I guess I encountered in the research that we've done on this topic, and I mentioned in my presentation, would be the ERAI sort of database and the sort of membership of that organization. So here you've got an industry, there is a huge amount of counterfeiting when it comes to sort of computer chips, and where this organization has sort of been established, and there's very regular reporting, I would say, from manufacturers when they encounter a sort of counterfeit or fake item. You know, that's very regularly reported to sort of ERAI, and then that's distributed to the members, all of whom sort of work in the same sector. And I think the benefits of that is you can be a sort of ERAI member, and I think you can maybe even be certified sort of by them as well as having sort of good practices here. And if there is some sort of issue that's maybe raised against your organization, you know, you can work with them to resolve that issue. Because again, in some cases, you know, the counterfeit may have sort of, I guess, sort of come from a product that you've produced, but it can occur from sort of further on in your supply chain. So again, they offered, I think, this ability where you can then sort of investigate your own supply chain, uncover where that counterfeit was, may have been introduced, and then share that information with the RAI. That's then shared with all members, and then people know further down in the sort of the tier 2, tier 3 world not to work with that particular sort of type of company. So I think from what I've seen, you know, not understanding is that everything in terms of what that organization offers, you know, that's an example of sort of something where being transparent and sharing information of incidents that you may have encountered, suspicious transactions, or even where counterfeits have got into your products, and sharing that more broadly, that it can benefit everyone, but can also sort of benefit yourself by giving you a sort of, I guess, a trusted sort of stamp of approval, you know, for operating. So, but I don't, that's a very rare in terms of having, I would say, in terms of looking at it across different industries and sort of different sectors. You know, I see that as that's kind of a one-off example, but it's something that would be great to move more towards in the nuclear sector if we can. Yeah.
Many thanks. That's really interesting.
Yeah, Leon?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. My name is Yan Pan. I'm a research associate here. I believe Sarah connected us.
Yeah, that's right. Nice to see you. Yeah.
Very good to see you. And I have several questions, if that's okay, but I think they're relatively short. One is considering Russia's role in building nuclear power plants still in NATO countries and the EU. I guess it wouldn't be counterfeit if they were sabotaging it directly through, you know, because Rosatom is a state corporation. And so how do you see that risk? Two is there are new reactor companies that have no experience building reactors, managing supply chains, nuclear supply chains, startups basically now building nuclear reactors. And their suppliers will also be brand new and new to the business because it's a new reactor concept, oftentimes advanced, whatever, small modular. And then there are tier 2, 3, 4, you know, suppliers accordingly. So how does this impact safety and security, and how would it impact construction timelines? Because I think substandard items were a source of delays in past nuclear power projects. So if you discover it's got a counterfeit, your quality assurance program worked, but then now you have to find a new supplier, and that could delay your project for however many years, and it might not work regardless. And then finally, I was wondering whether you could talk to the dual use aspect. So let's say the United States helps a country build quality assurance capacity, and this in fact happened with China, especially surrounding the AP1000 sale. And now the US government is saying, and this has always been a concern, is that that also improves their quality assurance for their submarine propulsion program. Like how do you, so on the one hand, there's cooperation, you need to cooperate with countries, major suppliers, but on the other hand, there's, you don't want to give them a military advantage. So those are kind of the three. You could choose to answer one or two or three of them.
Big question. So yeah, and I'm not sure if I can answer them all in any sort of particularly sort of rigorous way. I mean, I'll take the middle one first, which is more, I think, relates to the SMRs, which I sort of hinted at a little bit, you know, in this in my presentation as well. The fact that, you know, there are all these new designs on the table at the moment. I think something like 90 plus different designs have been postulated over the last few years when it comes to small modular reactors that may well be the sort of the future of nuclear energy. I mean, one thing I would say here is that I think a lot of those companies, you know, they've been working on sort of the designs and getting those design licensed, but I wouldn't say they would all necessarily follow through to actually building those reactors themselves. So, you know, probably other more sort of established players will come on board as part of that, you know, that will have experience when it comes to sort of supply chain management and procurement and so on. So that may help sort of lessen the risk somewhat there. Some may follow through to actually sort of building the reactors themselves. I think it's all a little bit, you know, unclear at the moment. I think what's interesting, I sort of alluded to in the presentation as part of those designs, is this idea that a lot of those reactors are sort of talking about relying more on sort of more serially manufactured parts that are used sort of not just specifically in the nuclear sector, but also in sort of other industries as well. So then again, there's going to need to be this sort of sort of careful mapping in terms of how those parts are actually sort of certified for nuclear use. It does happen, and happens quite a lot in the global nuclear sector already, particularly in cases when it comes to sort of like obsolescence management, where original sort of dedicated nuclear suppliers don't necessarily no longer exist, so they have to find a more sort of commercial sort of alternative, and then they have to go through this commercial sort of nuclear grade sort of dedication type program and testing on that. So again, it's something that can be managed, but probably more emphasis will need to be placed on that, perhaps in the future. Yeah, but it's definitely an interesting one. On the other two, yeah, we're talking about the sort of interplay of sort of geopolitics into this, and this sort of, and these have always been, I think, questions more broadly when it comes to sort of cooperation in sort of nuclear security or broader sort of defense and security cooperation, with sort of adversaries or or potential sort of future adversaries in this area. Yes, it's a difficult one. I mean, I'm definitely a sort of believer in sort of international collaboration and sharing of best practice when it comes to nuclear security and safety, and now extending it more to sort of supply chain management, type practices. So I would say that the sort of the benefits may outweigh some of the perhaps more sort of, I guess, sort of negative aspects when it comes to sort of increasing a sort of potential adversaries' sort of capabilities, in this space. But I think, on the nuclear sector, we really don't want to see anything sort of very bad happen to a nuclear reactor anywhere in the world. Is going to be damaging for the nuclear sector as a whole. So I think it is important to promote sort of collaboration and exchange of good practice in this space. But I appreciate the point that you are potentially dealing with sort of strategic adversaries in this in this sector as well. And then the first one as well, it's a very interesting point, that you raise, given some of the other actions which have alleged to been taken by sort of Russian-related operators when it comes to sort of other types of sort of supply chain, related sort of attacks recently. I think given the fact that those reactors are sort of going to be built and sort of managed by Rosatom helps to alleviate that threat, sort of somewhat. But it's maybe an interesting angle of this to think about, but not one I particularly thought about until now. Yeah.
Margarita.
I have a question. Thank you, Chris. Really interesting. I learned a lot because I'm not an expert. I cannot claim expertise on these issues, but as a person who is in the field, it's very interesting to learn about your research. So my question, I guess, may be simple. You mentioned several incidents involving counterfeit equipment in Mexico, Japan, and South Korea. How do you come across this data? How are these cases being reported? Who is reporting them? Just, if you could share advice how to look for this information and where to.
Sure. Yeah. I think a lot of we're quite lucky that you might sort of do an initial search and find sort of reports on sort of various news sites about this. But in a lot of these cases, I think in all of the cases, pretty much all of the cases that are in that handbook, including the non-nuclear cases like the crash of the sort of Norwegian aircraft that I mentioned. The good thing is that, and there's also examples from the US as well in the handbook in the US nuclear sector, is that often government bodies will launch an investigation into these instances, and then you have sort of very detailed sort of government and regulatory reports on this, where it's possible to look. And the one on the, I was actually having a look at it the other day on the crash of the Norwegian aircraft back in the late 90s, that sort of like 500-page report with every sort of bit of detail where they've done the whole investigation, where the sort of and coming to the conclusion that it was likely to have been a sort of counterfeit bolt in that particular case. So there is some very detailed information out there, albeit a lot of it is hidden in quite perhaps obscure sort of technical, regulatory type, reports, on this. But I think. We tried to sort of scrape the surface, myself and Zova and Sarah, who's sort of working on this project, in terms of what could be found out there. I think there are lots and lots of other cases which you won't necessarily find in the open source, where it would be great, I think, actually to work more closely with sort of industry to sort of highlight these, even in cases of unsuccessful infiltration type attempts, again, that doesn't really, that wouldn't necessarily make the news. And there'll be lots of cases, and you'd find this for other issues as well, where industry will want to sort of say that they have had counterfeits and they've been sort of targeted in this manner. So again, it won't necessarily get out there, but then that creates, as sort of mentioned, one of the big challenges here is a lack of information and information sharing. So, so there are some good cases. You can find some good information in these sort of regulatory investigative sort of type reports, but there's almost certainly a lot more information that exists, but isn't openly available out there. So it would be an interesting, project to look more, in detail at that.
Thank you.
Actually, I have a two-finger intervention on that before I go to you, which is relating to the example Robert shared. I'm not sure what triggers a government investigation. Does there have to be an accident or something major that happens that's really catastrophic for the government to become involved versus in a case like Robert's, does that get reported to the government in any way, or does that just get handled internally by the supplier and, they don't work with that company anymore? And if that's the case, is there maybe space for trying to create relationships with industry that are governed by NDAs where you can learn lessons about cases without explicitly publishing all of the details in a way that's compromising to their...
Yeah, I didn't even want to say, Robert, on that case, whether that was ever,
Yeah, there was, to the best of my knowledge, there's no reporting requirement at all on that. I mean, this was for the retail cell phone industry. I think there are safety issues in retail cell phones with regards to RF radiation and so forth. But I'm not aware that there was a reporting requirement. If the company though was serious enough about the quality control just on a retail product that's going to be out there, subject to reviews, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that served as its own motivator. But the questions, are absolutely important to consider. Yeah.
Especially since presumably cases like that only help the company that was hit, and they don't help the broader set of issues around counterfeiting if no one gets to learn from the incident beyond that. Yeah.
And I think what you say, if it is a sort of high impact event, particularly like we've sort of seen in sort of South Korea and Japan, where we actually having to shut down and the investigation launch as to why you're going to find lots of information on this, or if it's something that's sort of reported and blown out in the media. This non-counterfeiting example, but for example, the Y-12 incursion by the non and sort of anti-nuclear weapons protesters back in 2012. That was there was a big investigative sort of piece that released on that, and the US government really had to go in and do a very detailed investigation, of that for a variety, of reasons, but I think, in a lot of the cases where it doesn't sort of escalate to that type of level, that in those investigations aren't necessarily done and information isn't necessarily sort of out there. So there's been a lot of cases, but for some it will be in sort of national nuclear regulatory bodies where it's maybe been shared sort of nationally, internally, hopefully. In other cases, it will be within specific organizations and wouldn't have gone any further than that. So it's this interesting question in terms of how we can get more of that information out there. Can it be sanitized in a way where it's more acceptable to share? And I think these are really interesting things for us to look at, for international bodies like the IEA, maybe to look at how they might best sort of do that. Obviously we have that in other areas, such as the when it comes to, say, nuclear material trafficking, the incident and trafficking
that's what I was thinking of, exactly.
Database. That's a really example of how states have sort of collaborated, in this area, albeit, country contact points see more of that than you would see on the outside, but they still publish sort of high level analysis, of that, which I think can be useful when it comes to sort of combating this threat. So.
Great. We had a question down here.
Please, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Hobbs. My name is Lucy. I'm first year MVTS student here in MIS, and thank you for your presentation. I've never thought of this perspective of nuclear security. And I just want to know, so you talked about the drivers shifted from financial drives to state organized behaviors. And I would like to know, can something similar that has happened in Lebanon will happen to nuclear facilities? Could the same thing, a similar thing happen? Like some parts embedded in the nuclear facility could suddenly explode, or any other incidents?
No, it's a great question. I mean, I would say that, I guess I'm concerned about this shift. Is the first thing I'll kind of say. I wouldn't say that I have access to any sort of empirical data that would actually be able to show that the shift is happening, but I think we're definitely seeing sort of more and sort of worrying cases of where more sort of state directed supply chain infiltration or attempts at infiltration, and that concerns me. We're not necessarily seeing that yet when it comes to critical national infrastructure, but it's maybe a relatively small step away. You would hope that sort of state actors would be deterred from attacking another state's critical infrastructure through this manner, but we see this in other areas, like on the cyber side. That critical national infrastructure is certainly not off limits. On there, which makes me sort of, when you look at the case that happened in Lebanon back in sort of 2014, you can see how a similar type thing, it might not necessarily have to be explosives, but it could be, say, critical parts for like a reactor that are manufactured to fail after a period of time could cause a really severe event. And that's really I guess one of the main areas where I was particularly interested in getting involved in this research, to try and sort of work with industry and the community to stop that thing from happening. But I think the presence of sort of state actors and more sophisticated counterfeits from that high end, as was discussing there sort of with Robert, that's the really sharp, concerning end, of it. And how do you actually detect sort of counterfeits like that, where great care has been taken to actually mask their original origin, and they've really sort of been designed to pass a lot of the testing and inspection that you might do around these things. That's a real, that's a real challenging area. Hopefully we won't see it, but I think it's something we need to be cognizant of as a possible threat and think about what we can do to prevent this from happening.
There's a question over here. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I have a question regarding the research method. I saw you did a questionnaire research to some nuclear facilities or companies. I'm not sure which area you collected this data from. Sure. I wonder if you notice any variety across areas or nations in terms of awareness of counterfeit or solutions to it. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, so we created that survey. It was about, I think, 25 questions or so through this IEA coordinated research project. So there was it was ourselves, and there was about another sort of 15, 20, primarily actually non-academics, but those working in procurement and nuclear security at different nuclear organizations around the world. So we sort of crafted the questions with some input from them, which was really useful. And then we distributed out through the World Institute for Nuclear Security and also the World Nuclear Association to their membership lists. And from there, we got people to identify themselves as based on sort of the role and sector they worked in. So again, we sort of scrubbed out all the sort of academics and NGOs on that and just focused on the responses from those who were actually working at nuclear facilities. We did ask a number of sort of qualifying information in terms of, are you happy to say, the country in which you work, or not the region in which you work? And some did and some didn't. And I would say that, we got reasonable representation, albeit with a few gaps in. Not sure if I can remember exactly which sort of regional gaps now that we didn't have a lot of responses from. But I think we definitely had responses from at least, sort of 4 or 5 major regions sort of around the world, and at least 12 different countries I sort of identified themselves within that. So it was sort of relatively broad representation, but definitely not sort of comprehensive. And I think, in answer to your point in terms of how the responses differed, based on sort of country or region, there was some big differences. I think it's probably fair to say, and this is sort of borne out in the interviews as well, more established sort of nuclear countries that have been running power programs for a long period of time. We spoke to people in the US and the UK and the France. They've been thinking about these issues for a while, and they have sort of regulations, and they have sort of things in place, where they're looking to try and sort of combat this, albeit, there can be limitations. I mentioned the US example in my sort of presentation. But I think in particular for more sort of developing nuclear countries, or countries that are sort of coming into the nuclear sector, power sector for the first time, this is perhaps where sort of less exists in terms of sort of regulation or expertise and knowledge. So again, that's probably where a focus, needs to be placed, perhaps in some engagement in this area. And this is all sort of very common when it comes to sort of nuclear security more broadly. It's sort of kind of a national responsibility. As sort of the IEA would say, they produce sort of guidance and standards, but how that sort of flows down to the national level will vary in every country. Mm-hmm. So some countries have more in this area than perhaps others. And to be honest, every country's approach will be somewhat different, in terms of how this is regulated, and that's also perfectly appropriate. But there's some big variation between countries. Certainly. So. And ideally this, sort of needs to be addressed, whether it's sort of through the IEA or sort of other sort of bilateral engagements.
So you got a question?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hobbs. Thank you for the insightful presentation. My name is Dai Han, student attendees. I think in your presentation, you mentioned that there are different supply chain risks and shortages regarding counterfeiting. And I wonder from your perspective of view, which part of the nuclear supply chain is currently the weakest link?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I could actually say that in terms of particular sort of, I guess, component or product, necessarily. I think I sort of showed in my presentation and sort of the IEA talk about there is a very sort of wide range of products that have been counterfeited. What I would say that, the area of the supply chain that we're sort of interested in focusing on, as sort of mentioned in the presentation, are those deeper supply chain tiers. So again, I don't think you tend to have as much to worry about your tier one suppliers, so your direct suppliers, because again, you've gone out and inspected them and you've surveyed them and you've probably worked with them for some period of time. But it's more that the people that they work with and the people that those people work with and so on and so on. That's the area of the supply chain where, and again, if you look at other studies like that paper from sort of Cranfield when it comes to counterfeiting, that's where counterfeits get introduced. So it's more that sort of case of like, can you get a better understanding of your complete supply chain and those sort of lower tiers. So those smaller, if you like, private companies that may exist of sort of 5 to 10 individuals, be based in geographies that don't have sort of great laws or legislation around intellectual property and don't necessarily prosecute counterfeiting offences. That's where, the risks are arguably sort of concentrated. So that most companies don't know that they are exposed to that risk. And that's kind of what this sort of future research project is all about, trying to find out.
Do you have a sense for the total percentage of market share that is tier one versus other tier suppliers, if we're talking about nuclear entities? Are you getting most of your parts from tier one suppliers? Or are you getting 10% of your parts from tier one suppliers?
I think the point I was sort of trying to make there, and it's perhaps a sort of slightly subtle one, is that those, I guess you're getting all of your parts from your tier one suppliers directly, but the point is that, the parts that go into what the products that they supply you are sourced from elsewhere, or a significant percentage of that is sourced from elsewhere.
How are their components?
Sourced. So that's kind
sourced.
of
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So anything, because of the complexity of the industry that you're working in, any product that you're sort of procuring, a significant percentage of that is going to have been manufactured, and sort of obtained from other suppliers.
That makes sense. Thanks for clarifying that, Robert.
Yeah. And this will be quick because I know we're winding down, but in a broad sense, and I think your presentation really nicely illustrated this, is that there's a varied set of dangers and risk associated with the counterfeit industry overall. By and large, it is a negative, whether looked at it from a security perspective or a safety perspective. But in a very narrow sense, I have to admit, I'm wondering if the existence of a counterfeit industry may be supporting, even indirectly, non-proliferation sanctions. And I'm just wondering if in the course of your research, whether you've encountered any indications of, let's say, Iran, procurement efforts supporting Iran's nuclear activities, especially those under UN sanctions for a long time, and still under US and EU unilateral sanctions, whether that activity has struggled with counterfeiting, because it seems like that would be an ideal market for counterfeiters.
Sure.
Given that Iran is already, Iran's nuclear activities are already struggling with sanctions, dealing with shortage of supply, and so it just seems like that there would be a kind of a potential target for counterfeiters. And so I guess I'm just kind of wondering if maybe the existence of counterfeiting might actually be kind of strengthening or amplifying the impact of non-proliferation sanctions. A little bit of a provocative question, but I'm just kind of curious if your research.
Yeah, it's really, it's not an aspect we really looked at in our research, but it is a very interesting one. I think, as you say, countries that are under sanction like Iran, they can't procure, parts for their nuclear program from where you would, common sort of trusted, let's say, Western suppliers, and that's they have to go elsewhere, and that can open them up more to the counterfeiting risk. I think that's a very, that makes a lot of sense, logical argument. Again, we haven't really done any research on this, but I think I have seen this or examples of this in different sectors. Let's say, sort of in countries where they've had sort of big sort of cross-sector sort of sanctions, which has maybe affected their ability to get, let's say, parts for their sort of aviation, sector. And then I think, there have been cases of where they've procured perhaps sort of substandard parts, and there've been high, number of sort of aviation type instances that have sort of flowed from the fact that they haven't been able to get good legitimate parts from the international sector. So again, you could potentially see the parallels come across there on the nuclear sector, but it's not really, not something I've specifically looked at, but it's an interesting angle, to this. I guess you could see that as a sort of, potentially beneficial aspect, to this, if you looked at it from a specific perspective,
Very perspective.
But, interesting.
We're coming up on the end of our time. I don't know if you have any closing remarks you want to share, but this has been fascinating and lots of really good discussion.
No, I mean, not particularly, but I think, it's a newish area of research for us and one that we're really interested in expanding into. So hopefully there'll be good opportunity for collaboration with some of the people. That's cool.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right. I really appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for coming. I know it's sort of near Thanksgiving. So, thanks everyone online.
Thank you so much.
And we can make a copy of the slides available. There was only a few more slides we missed out at the end, so it's all,